In The Origin of Species, he wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Hey guys, I'm Bill Westers, and this is the Encountering Truth podcast. Welcome to the Encountering Truth podcast, where we examine the evidence for Christianity, engage culture with kindness and conviction, and encounter Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species, introducing his theory of evolution by natural selection. This is perhaps one of the most influential ideas in recent history. Combined with our modern understanding of genetics and DNA, the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is the synthesis of natural selection acting on genetic mutation. It has been absorbed by society as the default view for the origin and development of human beings. We have been so inundated with the idea that evolution is simply a common sense fact about nature. Nobody seems to even question it anymore, and they just accept it as quote unquote obvious. But is it true? As Christians, we often fervently dispute this otherwise unquestioned belief in evolution, and we don't appreciate it being taught in public schools and in a way that seems to forget that it's called the theory of evolution for a reason. But do we fully understand the argument and know how to properly refute it in a fair and accurate way? We can't make some caricature or straw man of it, and just so that we can easily knock it down. We have to treat it seriously and address the claims that Darwinism is actually making. For example, we cannot just say something like, if humans came from apes, then why are there still apes? Because that's not exactly what Darwinists believe. They believe that humans and apes have a common ancestor and that they have evolved differently from that ancestor. And yes, you might question why they think humans evolved one way while apes evolved another way, or you might even go back further and ask why, if a single evolutionary change of the first living organism and each successive one thereafter led to that organism's survival, then why would it also evolve in a divergent direction? In other words, why would evolutionary change result in branching out like a tree of different types of organisms simultaneously rather than a singular line of evolutionary development? Regardless, if you don't treat it seriously, not only will you lose respect, but you might also weaken the case for Christianity and your chances of convincing that person or winning them to Christ. So, of course, attempting to properly refute Darwinism can be a pretty hefty task, especially for the average non-scientist Christian. There are several different arguments against it, but they can get very technical and scientific and hard to get your mind around, much less properly articulate them to someone else. So in this episode, I'm going to try to simplify that a little bit. I'm going to give you three easy answers to evolution in a way that is hopefully easy for you to understand, easy to remember, and easy to share with your friends and family. Now, with that said, this is not a full-fledged scholarly refutation of evolution, nor does it attempt to cover every aspect or detail of the arguments for or against evolution. But as a teacher, one of my goals is to simplify complex topics for my students in a way that they can understand them and remember them better. So I often use tools like mnemonic devices or acronyms to help them. However, I often have to warn them that, this is actually just a basic framework to help you remember the information more easily, but it's not a perfect explanation. It does not cover all the details or nuance of every aspect. So this is more of a layman's case that you can hopefully turn around and share with others. And even if you're not an expert in biology, don't worry, I'm not either. But the good news is that you really don't have to be. These are pretty solid refutations, and the fact is that the deeper that you dig into them, and the details behind them, the stronger they become. So before we get started, we have to define what we mean when we're talking about evolution. In fact, if someone ever talks to you about evolution or asks you if you believe in it, you need to ask them what they mean by evolution. Ask for clarification, because there are two different ideas that people might have in mind when they say evolution, and one of them we can actually agree with and believe in as Christians. The two different types of evolution are microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution could also be called adaptation. It's when organisms have small genetic alterations to adapt to current or changing circumstances or environments, and it occurs within a species over a relatively short period of time. Some examples of this might be how certain bacteria develop a resistance to antibiotics, or how insects can develop a resistance to pesticide, or how house sparrows develop larger body size to help them survive in colder climates. So these types of changes or adaptations are observable. They can be seen even within our lifetime, because they happen more quickly or over a shorter period of time. However, when most people talk about evolution, they're not talking about microevolution. They're actually talking about macroevolution. Macroevolution is the idea that these small changes can be extrapolated over a very long time, even perhaps millions of years, and result in much larger changes, like developing into an entirely different species, or what they call taxonomic groups, which is even above that species level. So what do I mean by extrapolate? Okay, that's what I mean by extrapolate is that when people look at the small changes taking place in microevolution and just assume that if that happens for long enough and enough changes take place, then it will eventually just add up to those bigger changes in macroevolution. It's basically the assumption that the cumulative effect of microevolution changes will eventually result in macroevolutionary changes. However, although some say that this is quote-unquote evident or obvious, it cannot be observed in the same way that microevolutionary changes can be observed over short periods of time. Because microevolution can be observed, it can easily be accepted as true, but just because microevolution is apparent and obvious, it does not mean that macroevolution is true. To quote Frank Turek and Norman Geisler in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, however, that is exactly what Darwinists claim from the data. They say that these observable micro changes can be extrapolated to prove that unobservable macroevolution has occurred. They make no distinction between microevolution and macroevolution, and thus use the evidence from micro to prove the macro. By failing to make the critical distinction, Darwinists can dupe the general public into thinking that any observable change in any organism proves that all life has evolved from the first one-celled creature. End quote. Darwinists deceptively talk about macroevolution as though it is the same thing as microevolution, and as if it is just as obvious. Nancy Pearcey also points this out in her book, Total Truth. She says, quote, "The scientific establishment papers over the controversy by using the word evolution to cover two very different processes. On one hand, the term is applied to limited variation within existing groups, like finches and fruit flies, which is readily observed and which no one denies. On the other hand, the term is also applied to unlimited change, leading to the creation of new groups, which has no observational support and is completely speculative. This seems to be a deliberate equivocation in terms, a verbal trick designed to enhance the credibility of speculative evolutionary scenarios by linking them with minor variations familiar to everyone. Our baloney detectors should start ticking loudly whenever we encounter this ruse, end quote. So now that we have identified that the term evolution can actually have two different ideas behind it, we can start to see how the whole thing is pretty misleading. Darwinists treat these ideas as if they are one and the same, but this is actually dishonest. Not only that, but Darwinism has even been perpetuated by lies and mistruths. In fact, in his big book, Christian Apologetics, Doug Groothuis discusses the deceptive icons of evolution laid out by Jonathan Wells. These popular illustrations are used to promote macroevolutionary theory, but as Groothuis says, they often keep people from thinking critically about Darwinism. In reality, these icons have themselves been exposed as false or even fraudulent. But sadly, this has not kept them from being printed in textbooks and taken for granted by everyday people in everyday types of conversations. In fact, this is why Jonathan Wells actually titled another one of his books about it as Zombie Science, because these discredited icons are hard to kill. So one of these icons of evolution that just doesn't want to die easily is the peppered moth in England. There are lighter and darker varieties of these moths, but supposedly the pollution during the Industrial Revolution darkened the tree trunks where the moths perched. As a result, the population of the lighter variety decreased and the population of the darker variety grew because they blended in more with the tree trunk and were less likely to be seen and eaten by their predators. This phenomenon was illustrated in photographs showing the different varieties of moths perched on different tree trunks and contrasting their visibility. Of course, these photos were put in science textbooks, documentaries, and so on, and as quote-unquote clear evidence of evolution at work. However, it came out later that among other discrepancies, these moths do not actually perch on tree trunks. So the question then is, how did we get these photographs? Guess what? They were faked. Scientists actually admitted that they glued dead moths on trees. But still, these photos happen to still appear in textbooks because they are one of those icons of evolution, these zombies that don't die easily. What's more is that even if the photos were not faked, even if this were all true, it still doesn't show the peppered moth evolving to or from another species. They are still just peppered moths, just a different color. This would only be an example of microevolution, not macroevolution. Another icon of evolution is Haeckel's fraudulent embryos. Haeckel was a German scientist who tried to show that embryos replay all the steps of evolution. And he sketched these embryos of various vertebrates, from fish to turtles to chickens to humans, to show how similar that they were to each other as a way to provide evidence of a common ancestor. However, like the photos of the peppered moths, these sketches were fudged in a way to make the embryos look way more similar than they actually do in real life. Even his contemporaries called him out on it, but you know what? Again, these images have continued to be used and to mislead people into believing something that is not true. Another lie of evolution. Finally, a third icon of evolution would be Darwin's finches. It was found that the finches developed slightly larger beaks to help them survive during periods of drought because the only food available was larger, harder seeds. This was supposedly evolution taking place right before our eyes. But what they don't mention is that when the rains returned and the seeds became softer, the finch's average beak size returned to normal. The change was basically cyclical. And so as Nancy Pearcey says in her book, Total Truth, she says, quote, "It did not put the finches on the road to evolving into a new kind of bird. It was simply a minor adaptation that allowed the species to survive in dry weather, which is to say the change was a minor adjustment that allowed the finches to stay finches under adverse conditions. It did not demonstrate that they originally evolved from another kind of organism, nor that they are evolving into anything new." End quote. So clearly, not only is evolution a dishonest and dangerous extrapolation of microevolution, but it also has been perpetuated by these misleading and dishonest information that Darwinists have clung to in spite of it being discredited. Now, even though these icons of evolution have been disproven or discredited, the fact alone does not actually disprove Darwinism. Theoretically, it could still be true despite faulty attempts to illustrate the process. So where does that leave us? Well, we still have to provide evidence that beyond those false icons, that neo-Darwinian evolution itself is false. So this brings us to the main point of today's episode. The whole theory of evolution not only has been spread by lies, but is itself a big lie, a fib. You could even say a colossal fib of evolution. In fact, that word fib, F-I-B, is the mnemonic device or the acronym that we will use to help us remember our 3 easy answers to evolution. So here we go. First, the F in our acronym stands for the fossil record. How does the fossil record help us to refute evolution? Well, first let's look at what neo-Darwinism actually claims. So at the core of this theory, there's this idea that evolution takes place over a very long time by slow, gradual, incremental changes, leading one species to evolve into another. If this is the case, if Darwinism is correct, you would expect to find evidence of this slow, gradual process in the fossil record. You would expect to find transitional forms of the various organisms, the in-between versions, if you will. You would think that we would have fossils of all the various stages of the evolutionary process, from simple to complex, from one species as it slightly changed little by little into another species. Instead, what we find in the fossil record is that there are actually very few fossils that could be considered transitional fossils. And Darwin himself actually knew that this was the biggest problem for his theory. He admitted that, quote, "just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth be truly enormous. Why then," he asks, "is not every geological formation of every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." End quote. Although Darwin acknowledged this problem, he hoped and maybe assumed that over time more fossils would be found and fill in all these transitional forms. Unfortunately for him, this has not been the case. What, have we just not found many more fossils? No, of course we have. There have been plenty of fossils found, but as Nancy Pearcey notes, quote, "instead of filling in the gaps, new findings have actually made the gaps more pronounced than ever." Why? Because the fossil forms tend to fall within existing groups, leaving clear gaps between groups. Just as there are clear gaps between modern animals like horses and cows, dogs and cats. Put another way, variation tends to be limited to change within groups, instead of leading gradually from one group to another. So according to the late Stephen Jay Gould, who believed in evolution, he says, quote, "the history of most fossil species includes 2 features particularly inconsistent with gradualism," end quote. He says that for one, we do not see directional change, meaning change from one species heading toward another. Instead, the changes we do see is limited and within the species, not directional toward a new species. He says that the other thing that we see is that species appear suddenly. And quote, in any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed, end quote. Now, as an evolutionist, Gould tries to explain this away with a concept that he calls a punctuated equilibrium, believing that species evolved erratically, like being stable for a while and then evolving faster over a short period of time, kind of less like the tortoise and more like the hare from the famous fable, right? However, in reality, he had no mechanism or way by which this could have actually occurred. It's just pulling this explanation out of thin air because he has to hold on to evolution at all costs to support and maintain his naturalistic worldview. So instead of gradual changes with transitional and intermediate forms, the fossil record shows evidence of many new species bursting onto the scene all at once, fully formed in what is called the Cambrian explosion, or what some have termed biology's Big Bang. In this way, the fossil record provides evidence more consistent with a creation event than with gradual process of Darwinian evolution. So, the fossil record. Moving on to the next letter of our FIB acronym to help us remember the 3 easy answers to evolution, we have the I, which stands for irreducible complexity. This is one of my favorite arguments against evolution because it's so powerful all on its own to basically tear down the entire theory of evolution. Irreducible complexity refers to a system of interacting parts that, even when it is reduced to its simplest functioning form, it's still incredibly complex. So much so that if you were to remove even one small component of that system, the whole system completely fails to function entirely. Michael Behe, a professor of biochemistry, developed this concept in the early 90s and gave the example of a mousetrap. So for a mousetrap, you have to have all the components for it to function. Yeah, not just correctly, but or most efficiently, but in order for it to function at all, you have to have the wooden base of the mousetrap, you have to have the spring, you have to have the strike bar, and you have to have the trigger mechanism, right? Well, Chuck Colson and Nancy Pearcey explained his illustration by saying that, quote, you cannot start with a wooden platform and catch a few mice, add a spring and catch a few more mice, and add a hammer, and so on, each addition making the mousetrap function better. No. To even start catching mice, all the parts must be assembled from the outset. The mousetrap doesn't work until all its parts are present and working together, end quote. Some living structures have the same type of irreducible complexity, and in many cases, it's actually much more complex than a mousetrap and has many more interacting parts. So why is this important with regards to an argument against evolution? Well, again, Darwin's theory of evolution says that living structures evolve slowly and gradually by slight successive changes, one step at a time. Not only that, but if one small change does not offer a functioning benefit on its own, then it's not selected to be passed on to the next generation. However, if just one component of the system evolves without the rest, well, then the entire system just does not function. It's just like if you modify one part of your car engine without modifying the rest of the parts that depend on it, well, the entire engine's just not going to function. In addition, you would have to explain how the system came into being in the first place, right? For example, think of an outboard motor on a boat. You have to have the entire motor built before it even functions as a motor. If you start with just the rod, it would be useless. If you start with just the propeller unattached to anything, it wouldn't do anything. Even just starting with the motor itself would not get you anywhere. Just like the mousetrap, you can't start with one part, then add another, and then add another. You can't go step by step. You need all the pieces attached in the proper way, interacting together all at once before it functions at all. Again, Darwin knew that the problem that a concept like this would cause for his theory of evolution. In The Origin of Species, he wrote, If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, earlier I mentioned an outboard motor, a boat motor, right, as an example of an irreducibly complex machine. In biology, the bacterial flagellum is remarkably similar to an outboard motor and is itself a powerful example of irreducible complexity in a living organism. Michael Behe describes it this way. He says, quote, "The flagellum is quite literally an outboard motor that some bacteria use to swim. It is a rotary device that, like a motorboat, turns a propeller to push against liquid, moving the bacterium forward in the process. It consists of a number of parts, including a long tail that acts as a propeller, the hook region, which attaches the propeller to the drive shaft, the motor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the bacterium to the inside to power the turning, a stator, which keeps the structure stationary in the plane of the membrane, while the propeller turns, and bushing material to allow the drive shaft to pike up through the bacterial membrane. In the absence of the hook or the motor or the propeller or the drive shaft or most of the 40 different types of proteins that genetic studies have shown to be necessary for the activity or construction of the flagellum, one does not get a flagellum that spins half as fast as it used to or a quarter as fast. Either the flagellum does not work or it does not even get constructed at all. Like the mousetrap, the flagellum is irreducibly complex." Another example of irreducible complexity is a bat's wings, which supposedly evolved from its forelegs, but transitional in-between forms would have been more problematic than helpful. They would have been too small for flight and too large to move around quickly and avoid predators on land. It's not a beneficial adaptation for survival that would be passed on to subsequent generations. In fact, extinction would actually be more likely. Instead, bats would have to appear with functioning wings all at once. In fact, going back to the fossil record, this is actually what we see in the fossils of the earliest bats. There are no fossils of bats without wings or with some intermediate forms of wings. You could also look at the human eye, which needs all parts fully formed and functioning together. If you alter one part, it loses its function. How could it develop one part at a time? What function would an individual part of an eye have all on its own that would be beneficial to pass on? Likely none. And any possibility that someone could offer is just simply speculation. Frank Turek and Norman Geisler emphasize in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, quote, "The degree of irreducible complexity in living things is mind-boggling. Recall that DNA's genetic alphabet consists of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. Well, within each human cell, there are about 3,000 million pairs of those letters. Not only does your body have trillions of cells and make millions of new cells every second, but each cell is irreducibly complex and contains irreducibly complex subsystems." End quote. So, our second easy answer to evolution, irreducible complexity, is a very powerful one that, again, the further you get into it, the stronger it becomes. But not only do the fossil record and irreducible complexity provide us with strong evidence against evolution, but our final easy answer to the fib of evolution undercuts Darwinism even before it gets off the ground. Before a species can even start to evolve, it has to be alive. And I don't mean the opposite of dead. I mean that we must first account for the beginning of life itself. That is the B in our FIB acronym, the beginning of life. To be fair, Darwin's theory of evolution does not attempt to explain or deal directly with the beginning of life. But again, if you don't have life, Well, you don't have evolution. And belief in Darwinism is often rooted in a worldview of naturalism, which is the idea that that all that exists is matter, physics, and chemistry. So it depends on a naturalistic, as in not supernatural, explanation for how life could have sprung into existence from non-life. Now, scientists have long attempted to figure out how life could have emerged from non-life. But this type of spontaneous generation of life has never been observed. They have come up with various hypotheses and even attempted certain scientific experiments trying to replicate the process or for how it could have happened on the early Earth, but none of these have proved successful or even really gotten a step closer to how the spontaneous generation of life could have occurred by a mindless, unguided process. So one of these experiments is called the Urey-Miller experiment. In this experiment, by providing certain gases and charging it with electricity, they managed to produce some amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, right? However, there were several flaws with this experiment. First, it's highly unlikely that the early conditions of the Earth and the gases on the Earth, that they were like those that provided in the experiment, but would have actually been much more chaotic or polluted, uncontrolled. Second, they did not produce the types of amino acids necessary to make proteins. There are what they call right-handed and left-handed amino acids, but proteins, which are necessary for life, use only the left-handed ones. But the experiment produced an even 50-50 combination of both, making them basically useless for the creation of proteins. Plus, these amino acids, once created, would need to link in a very precise sequence just to be able to form useful proteins. Finally, even if these intelligent scientists had been able to successfully guide this experiment to produce the building blocks for life, the very nature of the experiment contradicts what it's trying to prove. It's trying to prove that life emerged from non-life by mindless, unguided natural laws. But in order to do that, the process is being guided by the minds of the scientists conducting the experiment. This would actually support intelligent design, not spontaneous generation. So, in order for life to exist, you need DNA. But DNA cannot be created or copied without proteins. But here's the problem. Proteins cannot be made without DNA. So it's like that age-old question of which came first, the chicken or the egg? How did either one of them even come into existence without the other? Finally, in addition to all this, and of course intertwined with it, one other argument about the beginning of life that Darwinists cannot sufficiently answer is what is called the specified complexity of the information carried in DNA. The DNA molecules are not just chemicals randomly connected in a double helix. They have to be in a very specific sequence, and that sequence matters. One little error in the sequence can result in loss of function or even death. The specific information depends on the order of the bases in the molecule. So if they are in a random order, it would be like random letters on a page that do not carry any information. The bases in DNA, the A, T, C, and G, are very much like the letters of an alphabet, but instead of having 26 letters, there's only 4 letters. But when sequenced correctly, they actually carry information. But it's even more than just like random words in a dictionary. It's like forming logical, meaningful sentences. The order determines what proteins will be produced and how the cell functions. In fact, according to Richard Dawkins, as explained by Frank Turek, he says, quote, "The message found in the cell nucleus of a tiny amoeba is more than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica combined. And the entire amoeba has as much information in its DNA as 1,000 complete sets of Encyclopedia Britannica." end quote. But how could all of this information just come into existence from non-living matter? In fact, Bill Gates even says that this is basically like a computer program, except something way more advanced than we have ever come up with. So there's other theories out there, but they're simply not plausible. For example, one theory is that it could have all arisen simply by chance, like winning the biological lottery against far more outrageous odds than any Powerball or Mega Millions we could imagine. But in his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, Stephen C. Meyer pretty much puts this theory in its grave. He says, quote, "The probability of producing even a single functional protein of modest length, 150 amino acids, by chance alone in a prebiotic environment stands at no better than a vanishingly small 1 chance in 10 to the 164, an inconceivably small probability. To put this number in perspective, recall that physicists estimate that there are only 10 to the 80 elementary particles in the entire universe." He goes on to say, in short, it is extremely implausible to think that even a single protein would have arisen by chance on the early Earth, even taking into account the probabilistic resources of the entire universe over its 13.8 billion year history. And a single protein, keep in mind, does not a living cell with its many hundreds of specialized proteins make. End quote. So implausible is this that some committed evolutionists have actually developed this ridiculous theory called panspermia, which means seeds everywhere. And it's really just a fancy word describing a belief that aliens, yes, aliens, deposited the seeds for life here on the earth. Besides just being outrageous and implausible on its own account, this theory has scientific problems as well, not the least of which is that it doesn't solve the problem of the origin of life. It just pushes it back a step. For an example, how did the aliens themselves come to be alive? So, we just examined 3 easy answers to the fib of evolution. Of course, there are more than just 3 refutations to evolution, but we chose 3 of the simpler ones and used an acronym to hopefully make it easier for you to remember the next time that you are in a discussion with someone about evolution. Or next time that your kids come home from school asking about what their science teacher told them. Although we have tried to simplify these arguments as much as possible for comprehension and memory purposes, we're not committing the straw man fallacy. In fact, the more that you dig into these refutations of Darwinism, the more technical and scientific you get, and I believe the stronger the arguments become. Certainly, we are all looking at the same evidence, and by nature, evidence is subject to interpretation. So if that's the case, then why are there such vastly different interpretations of the evidence? Why can we look at the evidence and see the fib that evolution is simply by considering the fossil record, irreducible complexity, and the beginning of life? Well, Darwinists look at the evidence and see that it supports evolution. Well, it all depends on where you're starting from. If you start from a strictly materialistic worldview, then you will be committed to whatever gives you that naturalistic or materialistic answer that you are seeking, namely that there can be nothing beyond the natural realm of matter, physics, and chemistry, and that evolution, therefore, just has to be true. In fact, you will become like Richard Lewontin, who claimed, and he actually said this, he says, quote, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of the science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. End quote. He says it outright. However, on the other hand, if you are willing to open yourself up to the possibility that there could be something more than meets the eye, an intelligence behind the design, then it seems to have a great deal of explanatory power. If we look at all the evidence and think of all the possible explanations of the evidence, we can use what's called abductive reasoning to find the most logical inference or the best explanation of the evidence. We can see the lack of transitional fossils in the fossil record, along with the evidence for the Cambrian explosion. And we can identify that this is inconsistent with slow, gradual changes and more consistent with a creation event. When we examine the eye, irreducible complexity, and see that all the components of those systems must come into existence at the same time, functioning together, then we can identify the need for a designer. And when we look at the B, beginning of life, how life can spontaneously generate from non-life with incredible specified complexity running through all of the DNA, then we can identify that there must be an intelligence behind that design. So, there you have it. You don't need weak straw man arguments against evolution. You now have 3 easy answers to help you remember and share where the fib of Darwinism falls short. F, the fossil record. I, irreducible complexity. And B, the beginning of life. I hope this has been helpful for you. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Leave a rating and review wherever you listen. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And of course, follow us on Facebook and visit our website, encounteringtruth.org. So thanks for listening. Remember, let's make it our goal to examine the evidence, engage culture, and encounter Jesus. God bless. We'll see you next time.